Hello, this assignment is intended to demonstrate a construction of a working model that Year 6 students may create to demonstrate key understanding of concepts. The main topic that is addressed is living things may change over millions of years in response to their environment. The outcomes addressed from living things may change is the use of evidence to explain how scientific knowledge can be used to develop sustainable practices and interpreting data to support explanations and arguments. The model that is created will help them interpret food webs and describe the flow of matter and energy between plants and animals in an ecosystem, as well as identify how the loss of an animal or plant affects the Australian ecosystem, and with a key focus on how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's sustainable practices continue to protect the environment. Prior to creating their model, students will be introduced to ecosystems through the book A World Full of Wildlife, which will explore Australian ecosystems, including desert, grasslands, and bushlands. They'll have explicit teaching on creating food webs and experiment with creating simple food webs. They'll investigate and practice classifying organisms as producers, consumers, and decomposers. They'll be introduced to Indigenous Australian perspectives, which include using sustainable practices to support ecosystems, as well as being able to explain the energy flow between producers, consumers, and decomposers, both from a scientific and Indigenous Australian perspective. This unit of work is based on the 5E instructional model, and in particular, the summative assessment of creating a food web out of a digital resource is something that is considered to be highly engaging for children and encourages their learning interests. The process of creating this model meets the following syllabus and content processes. In particular, it allows children to develop design ideas to build a prototype using design criteria, and it also allows them to make notes, journaling, annotations, label images in a multimodal text to document the design process involving developing a solution. They'll also be able to acknowledge the use of information from other sources. To be successful in creating their digital food web, students will need access to PowerPoint, an iPad, and a stylus, whether it be an Apple Pencil or something similar, a information about the Indigenous weather patterns and sustainability practices, as well as some deep knowledge and resources about their chosen ecosystem, such as the coral reef. The design criteria given to students is that they must make a digital food web that would explore the flow of energy between producers, consumers, and decomposers, explain how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples use sustainable practices to preserve the ecosystem, and also consider what might happen if an organism is removed from the ecosystem. Some troubleshooting things that I came across was the fact that it is one thing to create a slideshow on PowerPoint, which is the suggested method I gave my students. It's another thing entirely to create working pop-ups and hyperlinks within the PowerPoint itself in order to actually demonstrate the flow of energy. In order to overcome this, students need to be explicitly taught how to link pages to other pages within the same PowerPoint in order to create their model of the food web. Now, the working model will be presented in class by students on a projector screen. However, this is what it will look like when they're working on it on their iPads. My chosen ecosystem is the Gloucester bushlands, and the traditional custodians of this land are from the Gurunga Nation. To navigate through the food web, we'll first click on our hyperlinks. This one will take us to the completed food web. At the bottom right, we have a key that demonstrates what color code the decomposers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and producers and apex predators are. Now we can see where I've drawn with the stylus the arrows that demonstrate the flow of energy between the producers, consumers, and decomposers. Now to start ourselves off, we will swipe through and we can see that there are only arrows down the bottom that demonstrate the flow of energy from the producer to the primary consumers. Next, we have from the primary consumers to the secondary consumers, from the secondary consumers to the tertiary consumers, and then up to our tertiary consumers to our apex predator, the wedge-tailed eagle. Now we've also got our decomposers, which decompose all organic matter, including the wedge-tailed eagle, and this demonstrates the way that the nutrients will flow back into the ecosystem through the kangaroo. As we go through the slides, you will see that there is also this little triangle down the bottom. If we tap onto this, we go straight back to the home page. Now, if we go back to the food web, if we go through and click on any of these consumers, decomposers, producers, we'll find out their place in the organism world. For example, if we click on the green tree frog here, it will give us information about the secondary consumers. These are organisms that eat primary consumers to gain energy. Now, we've also got some information about the snakes specifically. We've got they consume insects, eggs, and other animals such as frogs, which is incidentally another secondary consumer. And whereas frogs consume insects like grasshoppers. We can return back to the main food web at any time by pressing the link down here. So now we're back at our food web. I might want to have another look at one of these up here. So I'll click on the dingo next. These links work for every single page that gives us more information. We just go back to the food web, click on our next informational graphic, back to the food web. Maybe we'll look at the grass this time, back to the food web, have a look at the eagle, and that is how we navigate our food web specifically. Now, part 2 of the students' criteria was to include information about the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander perspectives. So I'm going to return home by clicking this triangle. And now I'm going to go back down to the second hyperlink, which is called Indigenous Knowledge. Here we'll find a question: what happens if we remove a species from the ecosystem? Now, in many Aboriginal cultures, living things are connected through relationships and responsibility. This all actually aligns with the scientific understanding that energy flows through producers, consumers, and decomposers. So that is some information that the students would have learned as they have gone through their assessment here. Now, we can return home by clicking the triangle, or we can go to our next page where we can see a seasonal calendar. This one is from the Darawal Nation. However, the Indigenous peoples of the Guringai Nation also had knowledge that where they understood that removing a species affects the whole ecosystem, and they utilized the seasons to determine when to hunt for animals and forage plants. Now, when we go onto here, we can have a look to start off with is what happens if we remove a species. We're going to start with the grass. So if we remove wallaby and kangaroo grass from our ecosystem, a ripple effect occurs. Once they're gone, now the decrease in the food source for grasshoppers becomes apparent. It also decreases the food source of kangaroos. However, they can survive by eating the native mushrooms as well. Now, once the grass completely runs out, we will run out of grasshoppers. So they're no longer a part of our ecosystem. So this means there's a decrease in food for frogs and snakes. Now, what will happen is if there's no food for the frogs and the snakes, then we're going to start to run into some bigger problems, because that means that they have lost their food sources. There'll be an overabundance of animals like the dingo and the kookaburra, which is not entirely good for the ecosystem. Eventually, there will also be less fungi if there are less carcasses in the ecosystem, which means we'll see a bit of a reduction in the kangaroo as well. Now, part of what we're learning in this unit is to cite our sources. So we've also given students the opportunity to include links to where they've found their information and their images. Now, throughout this assessment and creation of the model, students will be able to demonstrate their understanding of all of the concepts spoken about before, because in particular, we're looking at the food webs and we're also looking at ways to use the design and process method. However, the one thing that's very important to note is that sustainability and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures come into effect when they're learning this information. So they've created a multimodal text that demonstrates the interconnectedness between plants, animals, water, and people, which is a core part of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures that they would have been learning about. They also would have been learning about the cultural burning practice that promotes new plant growth, which supports herbivores in the ecosystem. So to promote plant growth and ensure herbivores are cared for in the ecosystem and continue with the ripple effect is that they will do a cultural burn to reinvigorate the life in the grass and other plants in the area. This unit can also link to the Stage 3 English syllabus because they're able to use some of the stimulus books such as A World Full of Wildlife by Neil Layton to support further development of vocabulary and Tier 3 subject-specific words. It also enables them to develop the general capabilities of digital literacy because the whole nature of the model is creating it on a digital platform, and also ethical understanding because they're learning to have an idea of different perspectives when it comes to sustainability practices.